Well, I'd like to add my personal welcome to NewSpace 2018, and I'd like to also add a welcome from all of my colleagues across Deloitte, across the world, all 245,000 of my closest friends at Deloitte. We're thrilled to be a sponsor of NewSpace, and we're thrilled to be part of the dialogue. Before I jump into the meat of the matter, I wanted to just answer one question. That's, why is Deloitte here? A couple of things very quickly. One, we have been serving the space, broad aerospace and defense, and SATCOM industries for decades, and markets for decades. We serve effectively all US government agencies. We serve 95% of the Fortune 500 companies. We serve almost 85% of the Fortune 1000. We serve agencies around the world. But a couple of years ago, we decided, based on what was going on in the space ecosystem, to take a more concerted and a more focused effort to become a bigger part of the dialogue, a bigger part of the solution, a bigger part of the conversation in space. And so we've invested a tremendous amount of our resources, both human capital as well as dollars, to do that over the past couple of years. So I hope that if you haven't seen us a little bit more present in the different parts of the space ecosystem over the last year or so, that you will do that across different parts of the market. So that's all the advertisement I'm going to have for Deloitte this morning. Let me say that I've been working in the space industry for 30 years, and I've been a student of the space industry for just about as long as I've been born, as I've been alive, about 50 years or so. And I want to say, it's going to sound glib, but I think this is the most exciting point, the most exciting juncture in the space ecosystem that I've seen since probably the early 1970s. More importantly, though, I'd say it's the most critical juncture in the space ecosystem since the early 1970s. And I think we're going to, 5, 10, 15 years from now, look back at this, and we're going to conclude one of two things. We're either going to look back and say, you know, we nailed it. We midwifed a true renaissance, a true breakthrough in sustainable development of space across all portions of the space ecosystem, or we're going to look back and say, you know, we blew it. We just fundamentally blew the most important opportunity we've had in 50 years to build a breakthrough. Why do I say that? Well, there are a few things. First of all, there are a number of critical factors that are coexisting these days that, frankly, have rarely or ever coexisted in the space ecosystem. So, for example, we have money. Right, that's good. We have money, we have intent on the part of many of the stakeholders across all different portions of the ecosystem to make this a success. We have customers, very large customers, who are looking for a different type of solution than they have in the past, from different types of folks, from a broader set of folks. We have non-financial actors who've really catalyzed things. And importantly, we have lowering technology barriers, as you all know. All of these are critical elements to the stew that, frankly, have never really coexisted before. But more importantly, I think, is that, frankly, the space market, or markets, have simply evolved to a place where a whole different set of needs exist. And I'm going to get back to that in a moment. But before I do that, I want to take a poll. We're not at the breakthrough yet. There are a number of factors that are perhaps barriers to getting there. And I want to ask this group, I want to ask the sentiment of this group, if you have to pick one barrier, if you just had to pick one barrier, we just remove that one barrier and we could break through. What's the most important barrier to break through? I'm going to give you 3 choices, and then I'm going to take a poll, and you can only vote once because this is not Chicago. So choice number 1, funding. If we just had a little bit more money, we could really break through. Choice 2, technology. There are a few very critical elements of technology to break through. If we could just do that, things would be golden. Or 3, we need a different way of working across different parts of the ecosystem to make it more seamless. So those are your 3 choices. And if you don't agree with any of the, those 3 choices, just pick the one that's closest to your belief. So again, choice 1 is funding. Choice 2 is technology. Choice 3 is a different way of working across the ecosystem. So I'm going to do the old-fashioned way of polling. Right? Who believes it's funding? I see a show of hands. So for those of you playing at home, there are some reluctant voters back there, but a handful. Okay. Who thinks it's technology? Okay, about the same, maybe a little bit more. And who thinks it's a different way of working across the ecosystem? Oh my Lord, I've done my job, I'll see you at the bar. So that's what I want to talk about today, because it's not about funding, it's not about technology, it's about finding a fundamentally more seamless way of working across different portions of the ecosystem. And I'm glad I've already convinced you. So the bottom line is that we lack a common framework, a common language, a common sense of what it really takes to work across the ecosystem. So let me give you 3 examples of what I mean by that. And then I'll get to you, I'll present what I think may be the beginnings of a solution. So one that's close to, I think, many of your hearts probably. Let's consider the US government customer who's looking for more commercial solutions. And I put that in air quotes because I think commercial in this case is often not very well described. Yet they accidentally kill off innovation and nimbleness and cost structure and the goodness of those with overbearing regulatory compliance regimes. They don't mean to do it, right? They don't mean to do it, but it's the way that they've operated for decades and so forth. It's the way that the space market has operated for decades. Fundamental disconnect in terms of what they really want, what they need, and what can be provided because the regime is just different. Second example, consider an established space company that has been around for decades, and they're trying to become more nimble. They're trying to become more commercial. So they focus on the product, they focus on the technology, but they can't really evolve the way that they do business capabilities and processes because they don't have a sense of what the models are, right? They don't have a sense of what capabilities really are required and what the US government would accept, for example, or what the commercial market would accept from them. What's most important? Fundamental disconnect. Third example, third and final example. Let's talk about NewSpace. Again, air quotes, NewSpace. Let's consider a NewSpace company that's struggling to find a sustainable model, a sustainable revenue model and so forth. Yet they're struggling because they have to work with players across different parts of the ecosystem. Suppliers, customers, partners, cooperators, right? Who are in fundamentally different, who own portions of the ecosystem today and who deploy very different ways of doing business. Fundamental disconnect. So the bottom line, in my opinion, is what's missing is a framework. This sounds very consultant-y, and I apologize, right? But we all start with frameworks, and that's just our genetic flaw in consultants, right? But what we're missing is a framework that does 3 things. First of all, it recognizes that there are fundamentally different business models and operating models that must be allowed to coexist and to succeed. Statement of the blinding obvious, but we don't have one, right? 2, the framework allows people to understand what's required for each portion of the market to succeed. And 3, it provides a common language to understand which model is required and when, and how to work across those boundaries. So again, a framework that allows, 1, a recognition that there are fundamentally different ways of doing business that have to coexist. 2, what is required for each one of those portions of the ecosystems to succeed. And finally, the common language and understanding how to work across boundaries. So what do I mean by business model and operating model? Lots of different definitions that you can toss out there, but for the purposes of this, what I mean are the business capabilities, systems, structures, capabilities, assets that allow an entity, whether it's a government agency or a company, a startup, an established company, to execute their strategy successfully. So it's, what is the cost structure? What is the cost management or the contract or product accounting mechanism that's used? How does program and product management work? How does product development work? What's the production system look like? What's the compliance and regulatory regime look like? All of these elements, right, are vastly different, as you know, at least intuitively, across different portions of the space ecosystem. So I'm going to suggest that the entire space market can be described by 5 business models, right? And I've simplified this massively just for the purposes of this conversation. And for those of you in the cheap seats, you probably can't read them, but you can feel free to come forward if you like. I'm going to start on the left-hand side, what I call bespoke development. So this is where most of the space market has been for decades. This is where you've got infrequent programs, infrequent launches, infrequent vehicles. So you need to have differentiated leading edge technology. It's got to be leading edge for a decade or more. Cost is almost no object because you got to nail it, you got to get it right. And mission success is usually achieved by extreme oversight. Mission technology is the key here. And this is where lots of the flagship, very high-end, for example, NewSpace types of programs exist. Let me jump over to the right, to what I call the traditional commercial product or product line. This is the domain of, let's say, DTH vehicles or more standard ComSat vehicles. You've got a standard, stable design and product. It's low cost. It's not necessarily lowest cost, but it's low cost. Schedule is critical, right? And you achieve mission success via product stability. You're not changing things. So you've wrung all the gremlins out, right? You may customize a bit here. Beam forming, for example, in the case of ComSats, different types of band payloads and so forth, but you customize just a little bit, maybe 5%, maybe 10%. If you move one step to the left, highly tailored, this is where you still have a product line, but you're customizing more. You still have design reuse, but you have very selective application of leading technology, but it's focused on where the market really will pay you for it. Right? It's not willy-nilly, I'm going to have the best technology across the entire bus and all the payloads and all that sort of stuff, right? It's very directed. And it's reasonable but not lowest cost. The two on the right-hand side are a little different. Mass production, this is one that's, I'd say, newest as a business model. This is where you have, it's really a product line. High rate production, very simple design, very low unit cost. And you achieve mission success largely through architectural or orbit disaggregation and redundancy. And finally, on the right-hand side, what I call mass customization. This has been around for a while. This is typically smaller. I wouldn't say experimental, but risk tolerance is much higher. You're customizing at the edge. You're testing things. You're experimenting with things, right? Highly selective use of advanced technology, but in very small and sort of low-cost increments. So you could argue whether they're 5 or 6 or 3, but I would argue that at least 4, if not 5 of these can describe the entire space market. And from my being around for 30 to 50 years, I don't think the space market has a definition like this. And I think the beginnings of this could be very helpful. Because if you think about this, right, you've got, for example, traditional customers still operating over here in the Bespoke, yet they're saying they want to be 2 steps over. But they don't know how to define that. And so you've got contractors over here that have served, for example, the US government over here for decades trying to say, well, okay, I can sort of kind of do that, but I don't know really what you mean by that, right? So what do you mean? What do you really want, right? And conversely, you've got some NewSpace folks coming from the right-hand side trying to serve folks who are still existing on the left-hand side and working also in conjunction, sometimes as partnership with folks who are sort of somewhere in the middle. It's kind of cognitive dissonance, right? So, why is this so important, besides what I just said? I'm going to give you some financial and performance reasons about why this is important. So about 1.5 years ago, I did a study of all the space and aerospace and defense companies around the world. And what I found was something pretty interesting. I looked at what business models these companies deployed and business units, these business units deployed, and what the markets really required. And what I found is that about 60% of the space and aerospace and defense companies were deploying business models that weren't the right ones for the market. Let me give you an example, and I'll use a non-space example or two just to protect the innocent, right? So think about the military transport market, or the light ground combat vehicle market. These are global markets, right? These are markets where there's international competition in an enormous way. These are where there are reasonable amounts of units being procured and produced and bought, right? Yet many companies serving those markets still exist, if you remember the last slide, way over on the left-hand side. There are engineering changes, even during production, right? They don't have a real production system and so forth. So that would be an example of what I would call sort of incoherence from a business model perspective. And I found the same thing in space. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the financial performance of those companies who are deploying the right business models versus those who were not, the ones who are deploying the right business models outperformed financially their peers deploying the wrong business models by up to 7 times. 7 times. Now, the average was more around 2.5 or so. But even 2.5, that's big money. That's big performance, right? So if my comments on the last slide didn't energize the ecosystem, this one should, because if you have companies, and I don't care, if you're talking about commercial companies or more traditional companies, or if you're talking about government agencies serving those companies, if you have successful companies across the ecosystem, that's just goodness for everybody, right? So how can this be? How did we get to this place? I think one of the reasons we got to this place is because many people in the ecosystem forget that the space markets evolve in the same way that every other industry, every other market evolves in history practically, right? So this is a generic slide, but think about it. A market starts developing. There's no real value proposition that's working well. There's a lot of investment. There's a lot of innovation. There's the opportunity for a lot of differentiation and pricing power, but there's a lot of risk too, right? Early stage markets. Then somebody hits, or some people hit on a value proposition that really works. Demand increases. Profitability increase. Competition comes in. Starts to get a little bit of pressure on pricing, right? That's scaling. Go on a little bit further into the maturing part of the market. There's still growth, but there are a lot of standard products out there, right? A lot of competition. There starts to be some overcapacity in this industry, in the market. There's consolidation. And finally, commoditization, where, people still are making money if they're the low-cost provider, right? But a lot of excess capacity, a lot of competition, and so forth. And maybe then the market reinvents itself, right, and goes back upstream. But this is sort of a natural evolution that almost every single market goes through. And if you think about it, back to the first slide I showed, there's a dominant business model, really, that works best in each one of these portions of the cycle. On the left-hand side, that bespoke development model, that's not a bad model for early stage markets. You got to nail it, right, and so forth. Once you get further over here, you also go to the right-hand side of that business model slide, right? Folks who have product lines. Some people who have mass production. Those are the folks who do best sort of over here. You're never going to necessarily lose the folks who are the exquisite bespoke developers, because there will always be niche markets for most industries. But the center of gravity in terms of the types of model that works moves to the right, right? And what I believe is that vast portions of the space market have simply evolved, right? We've caught up with Moore's law. The space industry, the space market is caught up with Moore's law. And if you think about where, for example, commercial ComSat would be, it's not commoditized, but I would argue it's pretty far along on the maturing curve here. If you think about commercial remote sensing, same thing. Certainly the 3 to 5 meter stuff is, that's practically free at this point, right? If not commoditized, it's really damn close. And I would argue that for national security comms of the tactical type, unclassified sensing from national security needs and missions, they're not as far to the right as the commercial, ComSat and commercial sensing, but they're going that direction. You can argue that whether they're in scaling or maturing, but I'd say they're pretty darn close to that inflection point. And that's what we're seeing in the markets. That's what we're seeing in the markets in terms of interest and so forth. Yeah, you still have a fair amount of stuff coming up and developing and scaling. You've got space situational awareness and so forth. But a lot of the markets, a lot of our space markets have evolved away from the business models that a lot of us have continued to deploy. And these require fundamental shifts in how business is done. A lot of companies seem to have missed this. And I'm not going to just point the finger at established space companies. I think new space companies, however you want to define those, don't fundamentally understand this. I think the US government kind of is getting this, but they don't know what to do about it. So we're missing that framework. So let me try to put a bow around this and bring it all together, and I'll try to leave time for a few questions. 5 points. 1, we're at the most critical juncture in space ecosystem history that I've seen in the last 50 years. 2, multiple business models are required because of the way the markets have evolved, just naturally. 3, but there's no framework or language for understanding what these business models are or working across the boundaries. 4, the market is accelerating away. I don't have a slide on this, but if you actually look at a cost capability curve, right, in certain parts of the market, the market over the past few years has just fundamentally accelerated away. The curve, the slope of the curve, if you will, has steepened. And 5, yet despite all this, there's a huge opportunity. There's a huge performance opportunity, not only financially for the companies involved, but for the entire ecosystem performance. So again, 5 points. 1, most critical juncture. 2, multiple business models required. 3, no common language or framework. 4, a market that's accelerating away from old models. And 5, a huge performance opportunity for the ecosystem as a whole. So what can we, little old we, do about this? I'm going to make it simple. I'll give you a few simple thoughts. First of all, statement of the blinding obvious. Work across the boundaries. Think about a common framework and language for business models. What it takes to see. What business model are you in? If you're a customer, what business model are you in? If you're a contractor or a new company or an old company, what business model are you in? What does it mean to play in a different and succeed in a different business model? What business models do you think your customers, your partners, your suppliers are in? What model do they have to be in for everybody to succeed? Number 1. Number 2, do this first. That's a bit tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but there's a huge amount of capital and a huge amount of cost that could get frittered away if we don't nail this down quickly. And I think if I look at National Space Council, what they're trying to do, they're trying to lighten up the compliance, or they at least try to tailor the compliance and regulatory regimes. I think that's a very good thing. I'd like them to have a common framework and a common language within which to make those decisions a little bit better, perhaps, a little bit more quickly. And finally, more tactically for the next couple of days here, what I'd say is go talk about the technology. Go talk about the funding. Go talk about the markets. Those are critical things to talk about. But in every single conversation that you have, I'd ask you to think about the one thing. What is the one thing that if you could change or you could define, what would that one thing be to unlock a more seamless set of interactions across different parts of the ecosystem? And if you come up with a really killer idea, I'd love to hear it. I think for those of you who have bags and so forth, my email address is in there. I'd love to hear any brilliant ideas, because it's a tough one, right? So, anyway, I think we have time for a few questions, but thank you very much on behalf of myself personally, on behalf of Deloitte. I hope this gets the gray cells moving a little bit, in addition to the caffeine coursing through your systems. And I wish you a very best rest of the conference. Thank you. Questions?
From your perch at the top of the industry, looking down, do you see much in the way of mergers and acquisitions, either assembling organizations vertically or horizontally?
Yeah, for those of you who couldn't hear the question, is do I see mergers and acquisitions assembling different portions, pieces of the puzzle, horizontally and vertically? The answer is yes. I mean, I think one can see in different portions of the market, I won't name names, but people trying to do both, and people frankly trying to experiment. There are folks that have put together different pieces of the horizontal value chain and see if that works, right? Some pretty interesting things that have been going on there over the last few years. I also see a lot of vertical thickening, if you will, to the value. And again, I think these are all very good strategies depending on where you are in the market. But I also get the sense that companies are testing the waters. And we'll see which one wins. I suspect there's room for different strategies, different M&A strategies to win. But whenever you get into a situation where you have kind of the jumble of where the market is on the industry evolution curve, you get a lot of interesting inorganic stuff going on. So if that's what you're poking at, I think, frankly, we're probably in for, as long as the money and the interest keeps flowing, at least the next 5-7 years or so, seeing some pretty interesting inorganic moves. So, any other questions?
Yeah, I got a question. So a couple of slides ago, when you're showing the maturing of the how the curve goes down, I found it interesting because I was looking at that and thinking about how much technology readiness levels could even be put on the bottom of that.
Yeah.
You think that there's a strong correlation there between the TRL of what you're seeing in that particular part of the industry versus where it's at on that curve?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I would say that one can see the same evolution. What I would argue is that different portions of I'm going to use a consultant term, a value proposition or an offering to a customer doesn't necessarily have to be at the same TRL, right? So the real question is what TRL is what technology, what service, what aspect of the offering is most critical for that customer? Is it, I'm looking for the lowest price or the lowest cost? That will lead you down a certain path in terms of, okay, what technologies, what services, what capabilities really do I need to have a TRL of, umpty squat, right? Or if I'm looking for something that, has the most cutting edge, on-orbit propulsion system because I want to do X, Y, and Z, that will lead you down a different path in terms of the technology. So I think the concept is a good one, but I would say there's a lot of difference in terms, it's really depending, you really have to sort of deconvolve what's most important for the customer, and I think it's not a one-size-fit-all from a TRL perspective. So I think you had a question?
Yeah, just 20 years ago, the electric power industry had a very similar situation. Everybody thought between distributed generation, distributed resources, regulatory burdens possibly changing, that 1999, 2004, we're going to see tremendous change in the way the electric grid operated.
Yeah.
Arguably a 1% success for a lot of reasons. And I know Deloitte had a lot of people who were domain experts.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any comments or thoughts on that as an analogy of what can go terribly wrong, even though the technology and the commercial motivations are there.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I suspect all of you heard the point, but it was around sort of the juncture that the power ecosystem had in terms of disaggregation and so forth. It's an interesting analogy, and I will admit first that I'm not necessarily a student of that industry, but I suspect one could point at a few things that, again, getting back to one of my first remarks where, we either, midwife a renaissance and a breakthrough, or we kind of blow an opportunity. But it depends on which lens you have on. I suspect that, there are a lot of entrenched interests, right, from a power utility perspective and so forth. In that industry, there are a lot of sort of pseudo-governmental, right, interests as well. And so those interests perhaps didn't want to move in that direction necessarily, and consequently the regulatory regime didn't go in that way. That said, I think if you talk to some of the power companies, they say, hey, no, that was okay for us, right? That was okay for us. And some of the other ecosystems say not. So again, I think it's creating the language, creating the framework, and making sure that everybody's on the same page. But there will always be competing interests. I think Neil, we have time for one more. Is that right? Okay, one more question.
So the first bullet up there is great. We need to work across boundaries and fix this, but we don't know how. Yeah. So how about if we pose it this way? How might we screw this up, in your view? And by identifying that, maybe we at least know where not to go. Yeah. So was it a question or a rhetorical question? Or how do we screw this up? How do we screw this up? Well, let me count the ways. Look, I mean, the space, I mean, from an optimist perspective, the space market's not going anywhere. I mean, it's here, right? But how do we screw this up? Again, I think that, I'm going to say this maybe in not the way that you're looking for, but I think the firmest way to screw this up is to not understand what it takes to succeed. Now, how do you get different entities to do that? Well, I think there are more of the building blocks in place now than I've seen in a while, right? You have a very strong and growing set of companies, sort of newer space companies. You have a National Space Council. that could conceivably be used for part of this. You have portions of the U.S. government customer who are really trying to figure this out, even down at a kernel level and so forth, that are really important. And so I would say just keep plugging at it, and if we can establish a framework for people to throw stones at and to really understand things, then that's the way to do it. If we continue to sort of turn a deaf ear that everybody needs to, there are different portions of the market, and they have to act differently. It's the 12-step program, awareness, whatever it is. I've never been through the 12-step program, but whatever the first few steps of the 12-step program are, not getting to those would be the surest way of screwing it up. Probably not the answer you're looking for, but that's probably the best answer I can give you right now. So, thank you very much. Have a great rest of the conference, and I hope this gave you something to think about. Very much appreciated.